Thank you again. It's such an honor to be here. I hope that many of you have had a chance to take a look at the graphic medicine exhibit. I'll be referencing it a bit, but it's really, the great thing about graphic medicine, as Ian said, is that it's about being part of a community. And I'm having a very similar feeling here. I feel like I'm now part of a new community as well with .md, so thank you. I'm going to build a little bit on the brief introduction that Ian Williams gave us to graphic medicine, and then take it to a very specific area that I've been working in graphic medicine for the last couple of years. So as Ronan mentioned, I'm a nurse, and this is my elevator speech. When you do something as unusual as what I do, it's good to have an elevator speech, like you can just say real quickly. I'm a nurse who uses comics to help me contemplate the complexities of illness and caregiving. And when I say using, what I mean is both reading and drawing and teaching with. And as was mentioned, my clinical experience is in HIV/AIDS care and hospice care. Ian and I co-authored the Graphic Medicine Manifesto. This was sort of our way of putting a stake in the ground and saying that we firmly believe that comics have a serious place in the discourse of health and illness and caregiving. And as was mentioned, this is my book, my graphic memoir. The term graphic medicine, if you didn't hear it, Ian describe it, he coined that term, and it was kind of just putting that name to this idea of using comics in healthcare that ended up bringing us all together about 10 years ago. And it refers to the interface between the medium of comics and the discourse of health, illness, and disability and caregiving. And this is a screenshot of our website. I wanted to point out two specific things. The site is searchable, so if there's a particular clinical interest area that you have and you think, oh, is there a graphic memoir about there? Is there a comic, an educational comic about the work that I do? You can kind of look in there, and if you don't find what you're looking for, if you don't find something, please do email us, because Ian and I co-run the website with two wonderful medical librarians. And if any of you know anything about librarians, you know that librarians can find anything, and they're amazing, and we're incredibly grateful to have some magnificent librarians part of our community. And also, there is a Spanish language version of our site, organized by Medicina Grafica, organized by a wonderful group of Spanish scholars. And soon there's also in development and almost ready to go a Japanese language version of graphic medicine. And there's talk of maybe doing a French version. And this, I mean to say, that is this phenomena that I think it's not so much that we invented it. I think it was happening, but because of the stigma of comics, people weren't talking about it. And so now it's really just coming out of the woodwork. And then more people are being inspired, and it's very iterative. So comics are an amazing tool to use within healthcare, particularly in one of the ways that Ian mentioned we use comics, which is as a teaching tool. Because comics are great when there are three factors present. One, there's a high density of information. Two, there's a high level of importance to the information. And three, the learner is in a high stress situation. So you picture someone who's just been given a diagnosis of cancer. There's a lot to learn. You've got to make a lot of decisions. It's really important that you understand what's being told to you, but you're completely freaked out. But I also think this is true of medical students. This is true of many of us in many different learning situations. This is the classic example you see in comic studies of why comics should be used as an educational intervention. This is a high-stress situation. It's important you know what to do, and there's a lot to learn. Comics can also transcend, potentially, as you see in this example, transcend language barrier and literacy challenges, and they add this visual attraction and appeal to the information. They also are low cost, low tech, and have a fairly low bar of entry, which you'll see when you see some of my drawings. Comics also, we've talked a lot about story today. Making a comic and reading a comic is an excellent way to access our stories and to have access to stories, because they build one bit at a time, and that helps us to organize thoughts and feelings and kind of just focus on one thing at a time. And then they combine word and image, and we know that different things are happening when we process words and when we process images. And so it sort of brings both of those ways of learning to bear on the content. And maybe fun's not the right word there. They can be a pleasurable experience, even when a very difficult topic is discussed. This is an image from a book that's for sale out there by our colleague Dana Walrath, who's a medical anthropologist, who did a graphic memoir called Alzheimer's about her mother's Alzheimer's. And what she said about graphic medicine is that around the world, comic artists, caretakers, parents, and assorted onlookers are taking up their drawing tools, pens, papers, scissors, and computers to depict illness and ways of being human that have been stigmatized. This is graphic medicine. Comics, of course, have this long history of bearing witness to stigmatized realities. And I want to talk about 3 of those, and then the last one is what I want to spend the rest of my time here talking about. So the first stigmatized area that these comics, these graphic memoirs, can bear witness to is just the act of caregiving and the bodily functions that are, the work of the bodily function that are what most of the work of caregiving can often be about. This is a book called Special Exits by a cartoonist named Joyce Farmer. And as a nurse, I got so excited when I saw a bedside commode in a comic. Like, that's amazing. Because, you know, there's not very many other sort of cultural outlets or, you know, ways in which you understand stories where you're going to see this. But yet, a bedside commode is an incredibly common object in the care environment. And here also we see Joyce giving her mother for the first time a bath, and this becomes even more graphic where you actually see literally what the work of caregiving is. You don't see that. Even in movies where obviously it's happening, other places, other stories, you don't really just see it. The other area of stigmatized reality that these graphic memoirs can bear witness to is the idea that we as caregivers suffer and that we struggle. Ian Williams did a beautiful job of bearing witness to this in The Bad Doctor. This is a doctor, someone who went through medical school, who was struggling with obsessive-compulsive disorder and had all of his own struggles, and yet is seeing his patients. And he bears witness to this, something that most people don't even want to talk about and don't want to hear about. And then the third area that's stigmatized, that graphic memoirs have really covered beautifully. Following on that last idea about stigma, I tried to, the stigma of caregiver suffering, I tried to bear witness to this in my book as well. This is a panel where a patient that we've been following throughout the book and have hopefully connected with, just one day, the next day I go in and the bed is empty. This is on an AIDS unit in the 90s. And this image was when I was going to start to make this book about being a nurse during the AIDS crisis. This is one of the only images at that time that I really had access to, that I could remember, because it was so stark. You know, we've all had that experience where you come in one day and you've spent weeks, maybe ages, just connecting with someone and they're just gone. Meaning either they went to the ICU because you knew they were too sick to have just gone home, or you knew that they had, and this is the first way you saw it, the first way I saw it was that I would see this empty bed. But what do we do with that, right? We just keep going. This is Rachel Naomi Remen. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And that is actually a comic by a colleague of ours named Kurt Schaefert, who is a cartooning chaplain. He's a hospital chaplain who sits and bears witness to the stories people are telling by drawing comics and then giving them the comic about the stories that they've told. This is the last area I want to talk about, the stigmatized, and I want to spend the rest of my talk on this area, on dying and death. This is a wonderful book called Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant by Raj Chast. Raj Chast is a New Yorker cartoonist, usually single-panel comics or a few multi-panels. And the title comes from what her parents in their 90s would say to her every time she said, "What are your wishes? What are your wishes for care? What do you want me to do for you when you can't take care of yourselves?" They would just say, "Oh, can't we talk about something more pleasant?" And so she did this wonderful book talking about what that experience was like for her. This reminds me, there's actually a cartoonist named Ben Schwartz, who's a New Yorker cartoonist, and he went to medical school. And he decided that he really didn't want to become a doctor. He actually wanted to be a New Yorker cartoonist. And he said on a panel that we held once that coming up with a new Grim Reaper comic was like the ultimate cartoonist challenge. Like have a new take on the Grim Reaper. The first article that I published after I graduated from grad school was called Hospice Comics, because I wanted to put those two words together. Because I wanted to sort of like point out that these things that seem like they can't go together can. These are a number of graphic memoirs that actually show us natural death. Now, of course, comics have been showing us death for forever, but violent death is apparently okay. But natural death in a home or a hospice or a hospital is not okay to show, except in these books, which was a huge surprise, and I was thrilled to see as a nurse who was working in hospice. And I'm going to just I thought one of the best things I can do is just sort of show you around inside some of these texts. This book is also for sale here. This is called Things to Do in a Retirement Home Trailer Park When You're 29 and Unemployed by Aneurin Knight. He became his father's full-time caregiver while his father was dying of COPD. And this is an absolutely beautiful book that kind of marches through that literal care work. We already mentioned Special Exits. This is the scene where she is giving her father morphine for the first time at home in hospice. Joyce Farmer is actually a woman. She thanks her eye doctor in it because she has, I believe it's macular degeneration, and she's slowly going blind. And she said it was so hard for her to finish this book, and you could see the level of detail in her work. This is a really interesting story. So this is a book called Last Things by Marissa Moss. Marissa Moss is a children's book illustrator who had a long career. She does these books called Amelia's Notebook, which apparently are very, very well known. And her husband was diagnosed with bulbar ALS, and so very quickly they had to make a lot of decisions about feeding tube and a ventilator. And this is what we call in literature studies like a counter-narrative, because the story is we have this horrible illness and it brings the whole family together, and this story is the absolute opposite. Their family was torn apart. It was a very difficult course of his disease, very painful, very difficult. It was also a very difficult death that he had, and it was not a pleasant experience for anyone. There was no redeeming value in this story. And Marissa had signed up for a writing workshop right when her husband was diagnosed because she thought, that'll help me cope as we go through this disease. Well, by the time, this went so quickly that by the time that writing workshop was to start, it was already over. He had passed away, he had died. And so she wrote this all out in text, and all these, the whole story was very fresh for her, and she wrote it out in text, and she took it to her publisher, and she's like, I've got a great relationship with her publisher, and they read it, and they said to her, we can't publish this is too sad. And she said they literally told her, can't you change the ending? And then she realized, I'm an illustrator. And she was inspired by David Small's book, Stitches, to say, maybe I can draw something into this. And what she ended up doing was creating these beautiful drawings that actually give the story space to breathe. And she is there literally as this character with us and Sherpas us through this difficult situation. Harvey's journey isn't like that at all. He's being ripped from his life before he's ready to leave it. Neither of us has the luxury of time for the necessary mental, emotional, and spiritual preparations. Good night. I love you. We're engulfed, swept up, losing ourselves in the process, beating our fists and roaring no the whole way. Dying well means accepting death, just as an easy birth means yielding to the overwhelming pain, moving through it, not resisting. Neither of us knows how to do that. Neither of us has had the time to move beyond shock and despair to acceptance. It's a beautiful story, and I highly recommend it. Another recent book that came out is by Judith Margolis called Life Support, An Invitation to Prayer. And I know, Dr. Mannix, you talk about this in the book. Sometimes the thing that at the bedside, when the families talk, they talk about recipes. And so she literally started painting over a recipe of her mother's as she draws her father taking care of her mother on her deathbed. This is a beautiful book. By the way, I have a link on my website to every book that I'm talking about and a resource guide to everything I mention. So don't worry too much if you miss something. It's on the website under the .md talk. This is a book called Seeds by Ross McIntosh. One of the great things so on the way into hospice, I was given a lesson intact by a nurse. You know that your dad's dead, don't you? Well, I do now. One of the things and we use these kinds of books in teaching in medical students and encourage people to read them. It's sort of a safe way to critique your own practice. Like maybe you've not done this, but maybe you'll read something in one of these books like, ooh, I've said that once, and now I see how that kind of a statement is received by the family, right? Because it's the family members and the patients and their loved ones who are making these books. Visiting this again, this is her representing what her mother said. I know what you want, I know what Daddy wants, I know what my sister wants, but I know what I want, and I want to stay right where I am. Is that clear? This is an online comic which has been nominated for an Ignatz Award, which is one of the very few big awards in comics, and hopefully, fingers crossed, the awards are tonight. Hopefully Hopefully Nathan will win. Nathan Gray is a palliative care physician. And I'm just going to show you a few panels from this, but there's a link to the full comic. And what it was is literally what it says. It's just to sort of talk about the ways in which television and different kind of media outlets give us a very different idea of the outcomes of CPR than what actually happens. So as you see, this is kind of where he's going. And then he actually brings in some data and talks about the facts. And it's interesting because he talks about CPR as a ritual, and it's a very interesting framing of thinking about it. And he followed that up with a comic called Dying Words Aren't What I Imagined, which is similar and also kind of amusing. Many people's dying words fall into powerful, time-tested boxes. Thank you, forgive me, I forgive you, I love you, which is, of course, based on Ira Byock's 4 Things That Matter Most. He says, but some words just reflect the quirky oddities of our fellow humans. Don't waste a bunch of money putting my corpse in a box. I want my cat, Mr. Puff, to come to the hospital. My bowel movements have a cream corn consistency. This is a comic by Isabella Bannerman, who's a New York cartoonist whose sister is a palliative care physician. And we're not going to read through this, but it's just a lovely meditation on what the work of palliative care is. Again, the link's on my site. This is by Monica Lalanda, who's a Spanish ER doctor, and she's actually translated the ethics code for physicians into comic form for her students. But this is a piece that she calls, Would You Rather Live Dying or Die Living, to sort of use the visual, bold contrast there. And then goes on in this full-length comic, which, again, we're not going to read the whole thing in the interest of time, to talk about kind of showing this sort of battle that physicians feel like they're in between death. And I have to warn you, this moves very quickly. It might make you a little dizzy. Sorry about that. And then the end, again, this is linked on my website, is she's imploring other physicians, please stop dysphagia. So those are just a bunch of examples. A couple of colleagues of mine from the narrative medicine program in Columbia in New York, and I thought, could these comics could be helpful in actually getting people to do advanced care planning, right? We all put it off. We don't want to talk about it. It's really hard to look the person you love most in the world in the eyes and say, like, so when I die, here's what I want you to do, right? It's difficult. Some people find it more difficult than others, but could comics somehow help us have that conversation? Because, we know from being in the hospital that often the problem is no one ever had that conversation and nobody in the family knows. What does she want to be on the ventilator? What are this person's desires for facing end of life? So we said, what could comics help? I was very intentional in making sure that I, in my book, have the conversation with someone and sort of model what it's like. But the problem is I was drawing myself as like a first-year nurse, and I'm not sure I did such a great job looking back on it now, but I thought it was important to model that conversation. A design firm in San Francisco called IDEO actually had a challenge and said, how could we redesign end of life? What kinds of things, what kinds of interventions could we have that could maybe change the way that we deal with dying and death in the United States? And we decided, my colleagues at Columbia and I said, well, why don't we enter using comics in the challenge? And so we made a few prototype comics and thought about ways, again, kind of ideating about how we could possibly do that. And one of the ways we also did was a colleague of mine commissioned a New Yorker cartoonist named Emily Flake to actually make comics very much on this theme. This is called The End of Life, How to Talk About It, haltingly, with lots and lots of awkward pauses. So I guess we better double down on our binge watching. Bring it up super casual like, so Mom, you want fries or salad? And do you want life support or should we just skip it? Sock puppets. Hiya, pal. My human here friend wants to talk about what's happening, but he can't find the right words. Loudly because you've waited until Dad doesn't hear so well anymore. Not pleasures, Dad, measures. Do you want heroic measures? One more. What's your end-of-life plan? I don't know, but if it's anything like my birth plan, I'm in for a lot of unpleasant surprises. I want to be surrounded by friends and family, all of whom are finally admitting I was right. I want to do a ton of the funnest drugs a young person can bring me. One thing's for sure, if I get it notarized, I can sue God if things don't go right. And those obviously are using humor and kind of lightening the mood so the conversation can move forward from there. But this one actually doesn't particularly use humor. This is by a cartoonist named Whit Taylor, who's also has a master's in public health. And basically what she does is she has these characters kind of march out their answers to the question, have you had the conversation? No, I can't because it's scary. I don't want to stress my family more. I'm young. I don't know, my brother and I have different faiths. What if we disagree about what's right for Dad? It would be super awkward to talk about this with my family. I don't know, isn't this what doctors are supposed to do? I don't know, I think she wants to die at home, but I'm afraid to ask. What's the difference between a living will and a healthcare directive? And then just sort of putting it to the point of like having that conversation in advance makes it easier for family. Let us help you get that started. A colleague of mine who I was working with, a graduate of the narrative medicine program, but also a doctorate in divinity, who's a hospital chaplain, put together this little sort of notebook called Never the Right Time. And she's been piloting this and doing research on using these single panel New Yorker cartoons. You never think it's going to happen to you. And pairing those with kind of blurbs at the bottom of the page that say, none of us want to talk about this, but that's what we're going to try to do here today. And she very, very brilliantly chose these single panel comics to each target different areas of concern during the course of having these conversations. Like filling out your forms I cannot deal with, forms I will not deal with. Where do you want to die? The role of family members. His wife and family will decide on the course of treatment, but as his ex, feel free to open up a few old wounds. And that's been a very successful project, and I just show you a few examples from that. So this challenge that IDEO put out had so many amazing ideas. It actually turned into this thing called the Reimagine End of Life Festival, which happened in San Francisco and New York. And I want to show you a few of the ways we took our project and then took it out into the world and had it take on a life of its own. So what Lois did was she actually printed up those pages and put them on massive banners at the 53rd Street Library. And so right there, people could engage with it. And start, again, just comics about laughing about having the conversation. You're standing there with someone, you could just stumble into having that conversation, and then there's someone who's been witness to that, and perhaps you even take it further and document your wishes. We printed up a number of these comics like Ian did here and made it an exhibit called Death Panels. And then we had the books that they go with, so people could check them out from the library then. And then we had events with some of the artists. This is Raj Chast. Raj Chast is very good at death. This is Raj Chast with her rabbi. And we had a wonderful public events. These are two palliative care docs and a palliative care nurse, a hospice nurse, and a cartoonist. And they had worked on a project where they actually were in a prison where the inmates all had life sentences, and the prison didn't have a hospice. And so the prisoners themselves actually became hospice workers, and then this is the cartoonist there kind of bore witness to what they said about it and kind of talked to people about the project. And this was a public event we held around that. And then I did some workshops. Anyone who knows my work knows that I'm all about crayons. The chapter in the Graphic Medicine Manifesto that I did is called The Crayon Revolution, because I believe that actually everyone in this room already has the skills you need to do the work of graphic medicine. We all have our own visual language. We just perhaps stopped using it in 4th grade, unfortunately. So I always start these workshops with just getting grown-ups to use crayons. And also it lowers the bar of expectation. No one expects you to do something fabulous. But what I asked them to do, this is a comic about that workshop, what I asked them to do is just draw a good death, just in the most basic visual language. And I put good death in quotes there because, of course, it's kind of a crazy idea, but I'd like to kind of get at what are the elements that people think. I don't say your good death, draw a good death. So sometimes people will do something completely abstract, and sometimes they will do a very specific moment that their grandfather died, and these were the things that made it good, and then, again, we start these conversations. This proves to you have all the skills you need to do this work. This is actually by one of my medical students. I have my med students do this as well. And he said this was a fabulous situation. He said, of course, people are sad, but the person who's dying is happy. This is his grandfather. And they had a little child that got into the bed. Another one of my medical students did this and sort of abstract thing. She said, like, I think it would be really good just go up into space and just use up all your oxygen. And then I have them draw what came before. And the thing about a comic is, right, so you've got panel, 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 and in between the panels is the gutter. We call that the gutter. And the thing about the gutter is that there's an agreement between the cartoonist and the reader of how much time has passed in the gutter. It could be a minute, it could be an hour, it could be a second. And so I'm giving this ability to say, draw what came before, you choose when. And that gets really interesting. And then, of course, I have them draw what came after. So now they've created a 3-panel comic about death and dying, and this gets into all kinds of interesting things. And when I do this in workshops and when I do this with medical students, really I think the value of a lot of this is the conversations that happen. And I know that because sometimes people leave their artwork behind, which mortifies me. I mean, they're amazing. They're these amazing drawings. I don't understand how people just leave them behind. So that makes me realize the value of it was in the conversation. Here's another project. We have a colleague named Alex Thomas, and he has a company called Booster Shot Media. He's the pediatric allergist out there who has the allergy asthma comics. And on National Healthcare Decisions Day, he and these 3 people he's worked with called the live action cartoonists made an enormous mural. And what this says is, on this side is winter, and on the other side it says summer. And this space is the State of Illinois building in Chicago, which is a kind of a municipal building. People have to go there to get their driver's license. They have to go to get like all kinds of different forms they need, appointments they need to go to with lawyers or whatever. And they put this in this building, it's sort of hollow in the middle, and they put it right in the center. And this is an oncologist, actually, who founded a company called Life Matters Media. And what they would do is kind of stand on the periphery and talk to people, and people would say, like, well, what's going on here? And they'd say, well, we want to talk about, this is, National Healthcare Decisions Day. We want to talk about, like, what have you documented your wishes for how you want to die? And so then they would say, like, what's important to you? What matters in life? And then the cartoonist would start drawing it on the big mural. This is Alex Thomas kind of drawing some people's answers, and of course they would engage with people as well. And eventually people would actually were encouraged to just go up and start drawing on it on themselves. And so this was like really wonderful public engagement project to get people to kind of start having that conversation involving comics. Other places in the city, they were doing it more with kind of a live scribe in different communities, just asking people what's important to you, what makes life worth living for you. And then kind of from there trying to have conversations. These are some of the, this is Randy Bellosomo. The 2 of them founded this company called Life Matters Media, which is an amazing whole backstory of its own. In closing, I just hope you're convinced at this point that comics do have a serious role in the discussion of dying and death, and an incredible role that all of you hopefully will pursue in how it could be a part of your practice. Sometimes they're funny, but humor isn't necessary. It's always good to have a good poop joke. Thank you.
Thank you.